Well, he was my PhD supervisor, but actually I met him before he became my supervisor. I met him in Calcutta. He'd come to India to give lectures.
Anthony was my supervisor. He was the Vice Chancellor of ANU, and in those days, Vice Chancellors actually supervised postgraduate students. In fact, he also taught an undergraduate course.
My husband and I were both his graduate students, and I think we were the first of his graduate students to get married. We have photographs of him carrying our daughter when she was about 3 months old, so that kind of family photographs of Anthony, Belle, and the two of us. And we have photographs of him and his students based in Singapore.
It was interesting because, when I met him, he was the director of what was then the Research School of Pacific Studies. And by the time I came, he had been elevated to the Vice Chancellor's position.
There were Anthony students, then there were Anthony grand students and great-grand students and great-great-great-great-grand students. Now, it's a little bit like the Old Testament and just how many generations you can go from a particular founder. So his own students have had a lot of students and influence over the years and were, I think, all of us influenced by both the way he handled people trying to learn how to write big pieces of analysis, which he was very good at helping you with that. But he's also a very good undergraduate teacher. So anybody who saw him teach undergraduates said, there's things here I can steal or adapt, or I want to be like.
I think the most profound impact was really in teaching us by example how to carry out how to conduct, oneself in expressing a strong difference of opinion. Because he would always find a very civilized way of doing it, right? And I came from a culture of bickering. Indian argumentations are often like blood sports, and you come out mauled. And there are, you get that in some strands of English criticism, there are cultures of criticism. And Anthony definitely belonged to a culture of criticism where you never lost your sense of civility or even respect for the person you were criticizing. And if you really didn't respect him, you didn't criticize them.
Intellectually, the first time we met him, he was intimidating in his presence, but he made you immediately feel comfortable.
Anthony was a very accomplished scholar, but he was, in a curious kind of a way, a very formal man, always with a tie and suit, always very pakka, very proper. But he also was very generous. He put you at ease. He always wanted to know what you were thinking. He was always courteous, always curious, and I think that's one thing that I remember most about him. His curiosity, his desire to help, and his willingness to open doors for you. And that's one thing that remained with me,
So his legacy, first of all, the teacher's legacy is in his students. And I think he gave all of us this larger awareness of that you couldn't study just the nationalism of one country.
His own research was more on sort of South Asia and the imperial dimension, the colonial dimension, and his work is very important in that historiographical context. But I think one of his most important achievements was in the students he trained. All kinds of things, from Punjab to Bengal to UP to, and I think that the generosity of his supervision and the encouragement he provided to people who then went on to various corners of the world and became leaders in their own field. So I think, for me, I think it is that aspect of his life, the willingness to give, the willingness to inspire, the willingness to open doors, to train people. I think that to me would be his greatest legacy.
The really wonderful thing about him was that it didn't end with the PhD, and he continued to be interested in what you were doing. as the PhD turned into a book and in later years.
The other thing that I learned from him was, I think it was him who said, wear your learning lightly. And I think that's very important. So yes, a very human touch, a very humane approach, no matter how high or how low you were. He was always interested in what you thought, your ideas.
Well, another thing I remember is several things. One was that in his own way he was a great stylist. I mean, he wrote with particular flourish and with a very he had a kind of English sense of the English language.
There's the famous, the apple crab jelly story.
How do you write a thesis? Writing a thesis is like making crabapple jelly, and that was one of his favorites when people were kind of thinking, what is this thesis? Oh, it's such a pain, I don't know what I'm doing. He'd say, look, it's like making crabapple jelly. You find a crabapple orchard and you go out and you pick a whole bunch of crab apples, bags and bags of the things, and you haul them back to the kitchen and you boil them to reduce them. Then when you've reduced them to a bit of a pulp, you put them in cheesecloth and you pound them. You pound them through a sieve first, and then put the contents that comes through the sieve into a cheesecloth, and you let it drip overnight. And from your 5 big bags of cranberries, the next day, or whenever you finish the process, out of the cheesecloth, you've got a little jar like that of pure, beautiful, distilled crabapple jelly. That's how you might write a thesis, and that's how you make crabapple jelly. Well, I mean, he would have told all of us that story, and we've all told it, dozens of times, but it did kind of capture his whole sense that you had to be very patient, but you had to be diligent. You had to collect the blessed crab apples to begin with. No crab apples, no jelly, and you had to work on them. You had to they weren't going to just make jelly by themselves. They had to be treated, refined, and that's not a bad analogy, but it's certainly a vivid one,
So there were no compromises, and every time you gave him work, and he would look at it and there would be about 1 million comments. And the way he would start was, he'd say, I've just done this to myself. I have a chapter lying there. So you would kind of feel that, he's as rigorous and as harsh to his own writing as he is in terms of comments to you.
The family took in any number of graduate students as sort of honorary, it was like being an honorary fellow. You were an honorary fellow of the Lowe family. And his Bell Lowe looked after an awful lot of people in the course of 45 years, fed them and put them in the front seat of her car while she had to sit in the back while Anthony drove them out to the Brindabellas or Tidbinbilla to look at kangaroos and so on. So, I mean, Angela and Penny used to joke that you'd see a lot of the back of people's heads from the back seat of the car on these sort of Sunday outings to see the Australian bush. So the family were wonderful, and Bell was terribly generous and kind of kept him in the field, kept the army in the field.
And he was very encouraging in terms of, during the PhD, it's a supervisory kind of role, but I think he continued in that role thereafter, and very happily and willingly. So that, I think, everyone is close to their supervisor, but it was the relationship thereafter which made it much stronger. Of course, during the supervision, there was him and there was Bell, and one knew one could go to Bell for anything. She played such a big role in terms of, not direct supervisions, but in terms of being there. But thereafter, it was very different from what a lot of other students experience, because they do PhDs and they move on, whereas he took an interest in many, many matters right till about a year back.